A hidden code stitched into a singer's gown hides secrets no spotlight can reveal. Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I am your host, Alexander. This community keeps growing. Tell me where you're watching from today. Your comments make this journey unforgettable. Now, the story begins. The garden at Langford House glowed with the soft colors of late spring. Rhododendrons flamed against clipped hedges, and the scent of roses hung heavy in the air. Chairs were set in neat rows on the lawn, where ladies in pastel dresses sipped tea and gentlemen in straw hats chatted idly about politics, harvest yields, and the recent scandal involving a councilman's missing accounts. The afternoon was as perfectly English as one could hope. Polished, polite, and apparently uneventful. At the heart of this gathering sat Lady Clara Langford, the hostess. A widow of some years, she held court in a wicker chair beneath a striped canopy, her pale gloves folded neatly in her lap. Her smile never faltered, though her eyes darted now and again toward the temporary stage that had been erected at the far end of the garden. For today's entertainment was to be something quite special. The soprano, Miss Eleanor Whitcomb, had agreed to perform. She was a striking woman, Eleanor, perhaps in her late 30s, though she might have claimed 10 years fewer. Her dark hair was piled elegantly atop her head, and her ivory silk gown was carefully hemmed against the grass as she crossed to the stage. Some whispered that Eleanor had once performed at Covent Garden, others that she had left her career abruptly, though no one could quite say why. In a village such as St. Mary Mead, such mysteries invited no end of speculation. The crowd hushed as she sang. Her voice, rich and controlled, rose over the garden with a clarity that seemed almost to make the air vibrate. Even Miss Marple, seated discreetly near the back with her knitting basket resting on her knees, looked up from her needles. She watched the soprano with the keen, bright-eyed interest of someone who, though outwardly mild, missed little of what passed before her. As Eleanor reached the final note, a murmur of admiration spread through the guests. Applause followed, polite yet genuine. The soprano bowed, smiling faintly as though she stood before a far grander audience than a collection of villagers. She turned to Lady Clara, who clapped with a little too much eagerness, perhaps hoping that the brilliance of the performance would reflect back upon her own social triumph as hostess. And then it happened. Eleanor staggered. She clutched at her gown, eyes widening with a sudden, startled fear. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Some thought at first she had merely swooned, overcome by the heat of the afternoon. But as she collapsed upon the stage, a piercing cry cut the air, a cry too sharp to be theatrical. The audience surged forward. Gasps and exclamations rose like startled birds. Lady Clara half rose from her chair before sinking back, pale and trembling. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, her expression thoughtful, almost calm, as though she had seen such things before. Dr. Penrose, who had been seated with his wife near the front, hurried to the stage. He knelt beside the soprano, his fingers at her throat, his brow furrowing deeply. When at last he looked up, his voice was grave. "She's dead." The words fell like stones in the silence that followed. A teacup shattered upon the lawn, dropped from some trembling hand. Lady Clara let out a muffled sob. Around them, the murmurs began rising, swelling and twisting into speculation before the body was even moved. Miss Marple, her lips pressed together, rose carefully to her feet. She glanced toward the gown Eleanor had worn, her gaze lingering for an instant on the hem where the fabric had folded strangely as she fell. Then she lowered her eyes again, as though nothing were more ordinary than a dead soprano in the midst of a garden party. It was, after all, often in the midst of the ordinary that the most dreadful things occurred. The silence that followed Dr. Penrose's pronouncement had a peculiar, brittle quality, as though the afternoon itself might crack if anyone moved too quickly. Then, as if cued, the crowd divided into small, urgent islands of talk. Lady Clara's footman, uncertain and rather pale, hurried to draw the awning flap to shade the makeshift stage, and someone fetched a shawl to place over the singer's still form. The tea tables, so recently humming with pleasantries, became corners of speculation. Cups cooled, cakes stood untouched, and the rhododendrons listened, as rhododendrons always had, to human folly. Miss Marple remained where she was for a moment longer, as though one does not rush at a thunderclap. Her hands rested lightly on her knitting basket. She had noticed, in those first urgent seconds after the soprano had fallen, the way the hem of the ivory dress had kinked, oddly heavy along one edge, and how a single stitch near the ankle had looked newer than its neighbors, a shade brighter where the sun caught it. These were not, she knew, details anyone would confess to finding important. People prefer large causes of poison in a cup, a jealous rival, and a dreadful heart. Small things are not dramatic, they are only accurate. "Dear heaven," murmured Mrs. Bickerton, the butcher's wife, fanning herself with a folded programme. "Dead, and in Lady Clara's garden. She'll never recover socially." "Some recover from far worse," replied Reverend Paul Avery, though he said it with the anxious look of a man who will have to say something suitably consoling at a time not wholly of his choosing. His wife, Hester, was already gathering loose napkins and calling for someone to put the kettle back on, as if boiling water could mend a tear in the afternoon's fabric. She was too thin, said Mrs. Cicely Pratt, who ran the haberdashery in the High Street and held strong views about the correct weight of thread and women. "Opera people are never robust. I always say, a bit of mutton broth is better than all that London nonsense. I should not call Covent Garden nonsense," said Lionel Dacre, the accompanist, with a slight tremor. He was a narrow-shouldered man with tidy hair, and the tremor could have belonged to grief or fright or nerves. Miss Whitcomb was perfectly well this morning. "Perfectly?" Miss Marple inquired, with the diffident interest of one who likes a story to be told completely. "No headache, no complaint?" She was particular, he admitted, glancing towards the shaded stage. "About the dress. She wanted the hem adjusted, said the line was wrong. That must have been done today. I didn't see who did it." She took the gown to Mrs. Larkin, and Mrs. Pratt put it on at once, rather proudly. Most of the ladies do for what falls between a shop alteration and the services of a proper dressmaker. Though Eleanor Whitcomb is not one of our ladies, strictly speaking. She came in with a special request first thing. Mrs. Larkin keeps a drawer of silk threads. I've sold her all the shades. Silk's fussy, but it drapes. Miss Marple's eyes warmed. People told you everything when they believed you were admiring their supplies. "How very interesting, Mrs. Pratt. I always notice how a hem can make a whole figure appear altered. Like manners, they carry the weight of a person more surely than shoulders do." Over by the canopy, Lady Clara fought for composure. She had the look of a woman who could imagine the headline and feared it would be spelled exactly as she imagined. Her niece, Beatrice Langford, stood at her elbow, tall, fair, and with the uncomfortable look of youth obliged to pretend to know what to do. Beatrice's fiancé, Julian North, the estate manager at Langford House, hovered nearby, one hand around the stem of an abandoned glass, as if it might give him steadiness. "Do something," Lady Clara whispered to him, not quite quietly enough. "Anything sensible." Julian cleared his throat. "I'll fetch the constable, ma'am. Sergeant Rudd is already on his way, Doctor," Penrose called, not unkindly. "I sent my boy by bicycle." A small rush of relief went through the gathering. It is always comforting to imagine that an official will sort out the terrible. Miss Marple had seen that well-bred breath of relief often. She suspected Sergeant Rudd would not find it so comfortable. A sudden death on a summer lawn is both more and less than it appears. As if to confirm the thought, Sergeant Rudd arrived shortly thereafter, hat in hand, boots dusty, and expression grave. He was broad and careful, and he had a way of looking at things that suggested he counted correctly and did not hurry. "No one is to leave," he said, after a brief consultation with Dr. Penrose. "Name and address to my constable by the main path, if you please. I'll ask that we keep the stage area as it is." "Natural causes?" Someone murmured. "Best not to say," Sergeant Rudd replied. "That'll be for the proper people." He nodded toward the canopy. "And for the time being, we'll treat this as something that needs care." Miss Marple approved of that. Care is what truth requires. She watched as Lady Clara allowed herself to be guided to a chair, as Dr. Penrose spoke in low tones to the vicar, and as so many fine people organized themselves into soft conspiracies of talk. Within these hushed circles, theories bloomed. Mrs. Bickerton, who believed in clean living and punctual meat deliveries, proposed weakly that the singer had an undiagnosed condition. You hear of such hearts that stop, minds that fail. The stage is not restful. Mr. Pike, the grocer, leaned toward someone and suggested poison in the tea. "Not from my shop, mind," he added. "But you hear of such things in thrillers." Mrs. Pratt, in a tone both helpful and proprietorial, repeated that the gown had been altered and that the hem thread, if she had an opinion, looked rather newer than the rest. "Sometimes ladies have secret pockets," she confided, "for handkerchiefs or letters. It's untidy, but they do." A letter. Beatrice Langford had drifted closer, the color high in her cheeks. Why would she sew a letter into a gown? Mrs. Pratt beamed at having produced interest. "Oh, one hears of everything in a shop. Notes and things. Husbands don't always like to see everything. Or perhaps an admirer sent something unsuitable. Opera folk receive gifts." Beatrice's eyes flickered just slightly toward Julian North. He did not see it, being engaged at that moment in a quiet explanation to Sergeant Rudd about where the folding stage had been stored and who had hammered the nails. Miss Marple saw the flicker, however. She also saw the faintest hitch in Beatrice's glove, where the stitching at the wrist had been repaired with a less skilled hand than Mrs. Larkin's. Youth and haste are poor seamstresses. "Forgive me," Miss Marple said, turning to Beatrice with the gentle smile that had coaxed many confidences. "Did you know Miss Whitcomb at all, beyond her singing?" "Only that she was staying at the Rose and Crown," Beatrice replied, after the tiniest pause that could have belonged to sorrow. "She came with Mr. Dacre, and Uncle Julian arranged the honorarium. Aunt Clara wanted something marvelous for the party. Julian, hearing his name, supplied briskly. A friend in London recommended Miss Whitcomb. I'm sure there's nothing. Well, nothing untoward. It's all been very above board. I wired the agency." Miss Marple's nod was sympathetic. Young men often stated the dignity of their conduct before anyone asked. She watched Lionel Dacre's hands as he adjusted his cuffs and noticed the faint blue smear of pencil on his thumb. Accompanists carry pencil stubs and music changes, and fingers must remember. "Inspector Hawthorne will come from the county," Sergeant Rudd announced to Lady Clara, lowering his voice, which had the effect of making everyone else lower theirs too. "We'll do what's right, Dr. Penrose, if you'd be so good as to remain available." "Of course," said the doctor. His wife tugged at his sleeve, but he shook his head gently. "No, Hester. I was here. I shall answer questions." It is not easy, Miss Marple reflected, for a doctor to be near a sudden death and be suspected, if not by the police, then by the village's nervy imagination of having had too ready a hand with unusual prescriptions. Nothing so ugly was said aloud, but the possibility travelled in the way eyes settle and move away again. Talk, like ivy, found its supports. Someone recalled that Miss Whitcomb had left London rather abruptly some years earlier, after a promising season. Someone else had it on authority that there had been a patron, a gentleman whose name was delicately never spoken and thus spoken continuously. The maid at the Rose and Crown had noticed Miss Whitcomb receiving small envelopes at breakfast. The postmark had read simply London, which contained every story anyone fancied to put into it. A boy in the stable swore he had seen the Soprano walking by the mill stream late at night, alone. By the time dusk softened the outlines of the hedges, Eleanor Whitcomb had lived 3 or 4 lives in St. Mary Mead, and each life had enemies. Miss Marple, who knew that every village contains all the lives necessary for tragedy, drifted near the stage when Sergeant Rudd permitted, not enough to intrude, merely enough to be useful if a loose pin should threaten somebody's shoe. She did not look directly at the covered figure. Instead, she studied the staging. A carpenter's nail, not fully hammered, rose just proud of the plank, with a thread caught and snapped about its head. A thin glimmer of silk traced a loop upon the wood, almost invisible unless one's eye was trained by plain sewing and parish covers. She bent, ostensibly to retrieve a dropped handkerchief. Someone's lace left in the wild, and observed that the silk was a slightly different tone from the dress's main hem. Not whiter, exactly, but more determined. As if whoever had stitched there had done so in a hurry, with a thread from a different spool, even a different supplier. There was a little mischief to that decision, or a little panic. "Mind your footing, miss," Sergeant Rudd cautioned. "Thank you, Sergeant," Miss Marple said, smiling up at him. "I always do." The afternoon thinned toward evening, and at last people were permitted to go, not all at once, but in slow, chastened pairs, submitting their names. Lady Clara retreated to the house with her niece, the latter carrying a shawl and looking as though the weight of fabric might anchor her. Lionel Dacre wrapped his music with fastidious care and promised to remain available at the inn. Dr. Penrose walked home with his wife, their silhouettes close together in the dimming light. Reverend Avery went to the vestry because there would be questions that wanted the kind of answers he felt called upon to supply. Miss Marple went last. She paused by Mrs. Pratt, who was fussing with a stack of programs. "Terrible business," Mrs. Pratt said, shaking her head. "But you mark me, Miss Marple, there's something in that hem. One can tell when a garment carries a secret, the way it hangs. It's like a woman with a burden. She leans a little to one side." "I notice the same," Miss Marple replied. "It is also true of stories, Mrs. Pratt. They lean toward the truth, even when the people inside them try to stand straight." At home, the evening found Miss Marple in her sitting room, the lamplight soft, the kettle singing with a sane, homely sound. She took a single pinch of tea, then a second, because the day required it, and arranged her needles as if she intended to knit. She did not knit. She thought of hems in which girls had hidden notes to lovers, and of old samplers where an alphabet ran backward in a corner because a careful child wanted to mark a message that only one person would notice. She thought of London envelopes and village opinions and young faces that flushed too quickly when someone mentioned letters sewn where letters do not belong. On the window sill lay a short, dark thread that had migrated from the lawn on the sole of her sensible shoe. She lifted it with a fingertip and let it rest against a saucer's white curve. Silk, very fine. It clung with the quiet insistence of a clue that wished to be recognized in good time. In the morning, Inspector Hawthorne would arrive, and there would be orderly questions and a sharpened pencil, and a belief that puzzles are solved by sequence. Miss Marple would answer what she could, and listen to what people did not know they were telling. For now, she drank her tea and watched the thread. The village had spoken, as villages do. It had said too much and too little. Between those two, the truth usually hid, small as a stitch, strong as silk. Inspector Hawthorne arrived with the morning, as punctual as the church clock and twice as exacting. He was a spare man with a tidy moustache and a mind that liked shelves, things placed in order, one after the other, until the pattern declared itself. Sergeant Rudd met him at the gates of Langford House and briefed him as they walked, boots whispering over the crushed gravel. "Fell on the stage, sir," Rudd said. "Dr. Penrose declares death at the scene. No obvious injury, tea tables and such like, but nothing that points to any one cup." She'd just finished a song. People say she seemed perfectly well. And our hostess? Asked Hawthorne. Shaken. Lady Clara Langford is a staunch sort. The niece, Beatrice, and the estate manager, Julian North. The accompanist is a Mr. Lionel Dacre, staying at the Rose and Crown. The soprano, Eleanor Whitcomb, is also at the inn. Hawthorne took this in with no more display than a slight narrowing of the eyes. The lawns lay serene in the cleansed light after dawn, as though nothing ever happened anywhere that could not be put right with pruning shears and a sense of proportion. He disliked that kind of calm. It was usually illusory. They were shown first to a quiet breakfast room where Lady Clara sat, chin high, gazing at a cooling pot of chocolate as though it were a tiresome cousin. Beatrice attended her with a loyalty that was very near to fear. "You understand," Lady Clara began, in a voice that had once been used to address committees, "that nothing like this has ever happened at Langford House." "I'm sure of it," Hawthorne said, with polite blandness. "I shall ask you to describe the arrangements yesterday. Seating, refreshments, performers, anything that strayed from the plan." "Everything was perfectly arranged," Lady Clara replied, too quickly. Julian saw to it. The stage came from the village hall. The tea was prepared here, of course, and the music was a triumph until she broke off. Beatrice set a cup nearer her aunt, as if there are catastrophes that can be climbed down from with a foothold of china. "Miss Whitcomb," Hawthorne prompted gently. "Have you met her before?" "I had not," Lady Clara said. "She came highly recommended. Mr. North handled the matter. You must speak with him." Julian North entered on that cue, tall, practical, and smelling faintly of damp grass and rope. He gave the impression that if one told him to lift the house 6 inches and set it straight, he would at least measure for it. "I engaged Miss Whitcomb through an agency," he said, standing squarely. "Her fee was paid in cash from petty funds as they requested. There was a small additional cost of accommodation and meals, nothing irregular." "Did Miss Whitcomb have acquaintances here?" Hawthorne asked. "Not to my knowledge," Julian replied. "She and Dacre came by motor from London. He's careful. She was well. She was nervous." "Stage fright," Hawthorne said. Julian looked to Beatrice, who had flushed. "She complained about the hem of her gown," he said at last. "Said it had to be altered for the line. She took it to Mrs. Larkin yesterday morning. Beatrice knows Mrs. Larkin." "Everyone does," Beatrice said, a little breathless. "She does men's and small jobs. Miss Whitcomb insisted it be done at once." Hawthorne made a note. He had already heard of them from Rudd and the village. He did not much care for hems personally, but he had learned that anything mentioned repeatedly by those who sew and those who gossip often sits on a seam no eye sees until it tears. "Dr. Penrose," Hawthorne said a quarter-hour later, in the physician's square, book-lined sitting room. "No outward marks?" "None I observed," Dr. Penrose replied. "No bruise of significance, no seizure as I have seen in epileptics." She took a sharp breath, surprised. There could be any number of causes. The post-mortem will speak with more authority. Hawthorne nodded. "Poison?" Penrose lifted a shoulder. "Possibly. Not every poison stains the mouth or sends a color to the cheek. Not that novels tell it so. If she drank from a cup, it was one of several on a tray. If she swallowed something beforehand, we will learn it. She could have suffered a failure of the heart brought on by exertion. But her collapse felt deliberate, if I may use that word. The body knows when it has been pushed." "Pushed?" Hawthorne said. "Not by hand," Penrose answered. "By circumstance. Fear. Shock. I've seen it in those who carry secrets heavier than their frames." Hawthorne glanced at Sergeant Rudd, who wrote nothing of that down. Such remarks live ahead of ink. "Thank you, Doctor. We shall speak again." At mid-morning, Miss Marple, neat as always and conveying in a way she never deliberately assumed the air of someone who had come merely to return a lost glove, crossed the high street to Mrs. Larkin's. The little workroom above the ironmonger's smelled of starch, hot metal, and lavender pins. Mrs. Larkin herself, a small woman with gentle hands and a backbone of wire, stood from her machine with the flustered gratitude of one who longs to talk to the right person and fears the wrong one will arrive instead. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, pressing her palm to her apron. "The inspector hasn't been yet. I've tidied the counter and I've put aside what I used." "How sensible," Miss Marple murmured. "I did not like to be forward, but I thought I might ask as a neighborly person so that when the inspector comes, you will have your thoughts in order." Mrs. Larkin swallowed and nodded. "She brought the gown at 10 o'clock, she began. "Ivory silk, very fine. Whoever made it knew their business." The hem was hand-rolled like a whisper. She wanted it altered at once. Said the fall was wrong outside. She said something about the air being damp, the lawn uneven, and the skirt needing a slightly different swing. "How interesting," Miss Marple said. "Did she mention weight? Some singers prefer a little weight to quiet them." "She did ask for a ribbon run inside," Mrs. Larkin said, "but in a very particular pattern. She had a paper with numbers. She showed it and then took it back at once. She said she would guide me as I stitched long here and short there. I told her that's not usual, but she was firm. She had her own silk thread, a little darker than I would have chosen. I said so. She said the slightest contrast mattered to her." "In contrast?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "And you followed her instructions?" "As near as may be," Mrs. Larkin said. "She was impatient. She stood over me when I had to fetch more needles from the drawer. Well, she pricked her finger. Tiny thing. She sucked it and laughed and said she'd had worse from critics. There was no blood on the gown. I'm sure of that. I pressed the hem and she put it on then and there. She paid in coins and hurried off." Miss Marple accepted the small scrap. Mrs. Larkin now offered a curled, spent length of silk from the spool. It lay like a hair across her glove. "As near as may be, Mrs." Larkin said. "She was impatient. She stood over me. When I had to fetch more needles from the drawer, well, she pricked her finger. Tiny thing. She sucked it and laughed and said she'd had worse from critics. There was no blood on the gown. I'm sure of that. I pressed the hem and she put it on then and there. She paid in coins and hurried off." Miss Marple accepted the small scrap. Mrs. Larkin now offered a curled, spent length of silk from the spool. It lay like a hair across her glove. "This is not from Mrs. Pratt's shop," Miss Marple said, as if saying that one's cousin prefers brown bread. "It has a foreign twist. I've seen such parcels from France." Mrs. Larkin looked surprised and then respectful. "You have an eye, Miss Marple. I thought it was different, but silk is silk to most folks." She had 2 tiny spools in her case. I could see them. She kept them close. "It is a comfort to keep things close," Miss Marple said. "One never knows who may tidy away what one needs." She left Mrs. Larkin soothed and in tidy possession of her story and walked to the Rose and Crown. The inn dozed in the pale sun. The roses along the eaves were a little past their best and all the prettier for it. Mr. Prowse, the landlord, had already polished the bar to a high morality and was now catching up with the serious work of looking as though nothing ever happened here except rest. "Is not from Mrs. Pratt's shop," Miss Marple said, as if saying that one's cousin prefers brown bread. "It has a foreign twist. I've seen such parcels from France." Mrs. Larkin looked surprised and then respectful. "You have an eye, Miss Marple. I thought it was different, but silk is silk to most folks." She had 2 tiny spools in her case. I could see them. She kept them close. "It is a comfort to keep things close," Miss Marple said. "One never knows who may tidy away what one needs." She left Mrs. Larkin soothed and in tidy possession of her story and walked to the Rose and Crown. The inn dozed in the pale sun. The roses along the eaves were a little past their best, and all the prettier for it. Mr. Prowse, the landlord, had already polished the bar to a high morality and was now catching up with the serious work of looking as though nothing ever happened here except rest. "Terrible about the singer, miss," he said, lowering his voice without lowering it at all. "We keep a respectable house." "I have always found it so," Miss Marple said. "I wonder about her post. Had Miss Whitcomb any letters?" "2 yesterday," Mr. Prowse said, and produced a little book in which he entered such trifles. "One by post, one by hand. The posted one came from London. The hand-delivered one arrived in the afternoon in a plain envelope. No stamp. Young Tom from the station said a gentleman on a motorbike gave it to him with a penny to bring it along. Miss Whitcomb took them both. She went upstairs, and shortly after, the maid Mabel went to turn down the bed for her rest. She says there were bits of paper in the grate. Torn fine, as if one were ashamed of the handwriting. Some handwriting inspires that feeling," Miss Marple said dryly. "And Mr. Dacre, the accompanist, did he dine with her?" "He had cold beef and a pint at 6:30, Mr. Prowse said. "She sent down for chicken broth at 7 and a slice of apple tart. Ate little. Went out at 6:30, alone. Back by 8. I believe Mr. Dacre called on her for a few minutes before they left for Langford House." Miss Marple thanked him and asked, as one who is merely thorough, whether the inn's sewing basket was in its usual place. It was. She lifted the lid. Cotton reels in common shades, stout and plain. No silk. She smiled and shut it gently. Inspector Hawthorne arrived at the inn as she was leaving. He touched his hat, and she inclined her head. "Miss Marple," he said in the tone a practical man uses with a clever aunt. "Collecting your morning loaf of gossip." "Gossip keeps badly if you slice it too soon," she answered. "I only look at the crust." He smiled, despite himself, and went in. Miss Marple stood a moment by the door and considered the baskets of geraniums. They were red. She thought of the soprano pricking her finger and laughing. People laughed more often than one would expect when pain is small and meaning is large. Hawthorne's interview with Lionel Dacre went as such interviews often do when a man is afraid of appearing afraid. Dacre insisted on making tea himself in the little parlour, and then forgot to pour it. "I accompanied Miss Whitcomb in London some years ago," he said, beginning at the middle. "She was formidable on a good day, impossible on a poor one. Yesterday was one of the poor ones. She was anxious about the programme, kept changing her mind about the second aria, said the air would make high notes travel oddly, asked me to cut a bar here and there. That is why I had the pencil." "Was your relationship professional?" Hawthorne asked. Dacre's jaw worked. "Entirely. We quarrelled once, if you mean that. A musician's quarrel, tempi and expression." She held the purse strings. "Well, it doesn't matter now." "It may," Hawthorne said. "Did she receive any visitors at the inn?" "A note came in the afternoon," Dacre admitted. "She showed me a corner of it and said, 'They never tire of trying to arrange my life.' I asked who they were, and she laughed. She laughed a great deal yesterday at inconvenient moments. She said she had found a way to be perfectly safe." "Safe," Hawthorne repeated. "From whom, Mr. Dacre?" She didn't say anything. Dacre looked at his hands. "She had enemies, Inspector. Singers often do. People expect too much from voices and far too much from women who possess them." When Hawthorne left, he found Miss Marple half a street away, examining cabbages in Mr. Pike's display with what might have been intense interest or a kind heart for cabbages. She did not offer advice. She seldom did unless requested. But there is a sort of counsel in a steady presence, and Hawthorne found, in his brief experience, that she did not waste one's time. "You have been to Mrs. Larkin," he said. "I have," Miss Marple replied. "She is worried she did something wrong. People are very ready to accept blame if doing so might keep order. And did she? Hawthorne asked. Wrong is a strong word, Miss Marple said. She followed instructions. That is often the wrong thing when the person instructing is desperate. Hawthorne made a small sound. You think Miss Whitcomb was desperate? I think she was doing something complicated under the guise of something ordinary, Miss Marple said. A very common practice. I've known parishioners to hide spite under civility, greed under charity, and fear under music. To stitch in a pattern according to a paper, well, that reminds me of samplers. And samplers are messages. Little girls have been sending messages in cross-stitch for generations. Why shouldn't a singer send one in silk? Hawthorne looked at her. A message to whom? Ah, Miss Marple said, that is what your shelves will reveal when everything is put in its place. To find the shelf, one must first find the book. I think the book may be at the inn in the wastepaper basket, reduced to confetti. The inspector's mouth twitched. Sergeant Rudd will retrieve the grate and the basket. Very good, Miss Marple said. And if you are going to speak to Lady Clara again, you might ask who persuaded her to engage Miss Whitcomb. There is often a small pressure that everyone forgets once the great pressure arrives. By noon, the village felt the investigation proceeding like a weather system, low clouds of questioning over the inn, a breeze of notes through the vicarage, and a soft but persistent rain at Langford House. Beatrice, in her aunt's sitting room, pretended to mend a pair of gloves and pricked her finger twice. Her fiancé, Julian, came to the door with ledgers under his arm and a reassuring smile that didn't reach his eyes. "B," he said, closing the door with his heel. "It will be all right." "I wish you would not say that," she replied. "Things are often not." He looked at the gloves. "They were fine yesterday." "They were not," she said, and then shook her head. "I mean, the day was not fine. Do you know that Miss Whitcomb received a letter by hand?" "I've heard everything," he said, with exhaustion that was largely pride. "It will sort itself." She made a sound that could have been a laugh and could have been a sob. "I didn't like her, Julian." He paused. "Why?" "Because she looked at you as if she knew you," Beatrice said, surprising herself with the truth, which had been waiting under her tongue like a mint one forgets one has placed there, and because you looked as if you might know her if you tried. Julian placed the ledgers on a table with more force than necessary. "Beatrice, don't. I met her yesterday. I have met many artists in arranging these things." She lifted her eyes and saw he believed this, which was different from it being true. Truths often sit adjacent to belief and borrow its clothing. At the end of the day, Miss Marple laid the short, dark thread on a sheet of paper beside the scrap Mrs. Larkin had given her. They were near in shade, but not twins. She would take them to Mrs. Pratt on the morrow and ask for a shade number, because shops remember what people forget. The inspector would have a post-mortem report soon, a date, a time, and the slow science of certainty. She wished him well. For herself, she watched the light fade along the sill and thought of the pattern of stitches Mrs. Larkin had been asked to sew. Long, short, long. One could say many things with such a language if one wanted very much to speak and had no safe ear to hear. When she rose at last, she straightened a cushion that did not need straightening. Some habits comfort the hands while the mind attends to darker work. Tomorrow would bring a search of Miss Whitcomb's room, a catalogue of the papers the fire had not swallowed, and perhaps a conversation with the maid who had noticed something and could not yet put a name to it. People often cannot find the name for what frightens them, but they can tell you what was where before it moved. That, Miss Marple knew, is nearly always enough to begin. Inspector Hawthorne, with the air of a man who preferred swift decisions to prolonged puzzles, began his next inquiries with a determined stride. It was the natural course of such investigations that one person emerged as the likely culprit, if only to satisfy the human need for order in disorder. By mid-morning, the whispers of the village had already provided him with a candidate, Lionel Dacre, the accompanist. The inn's little parlour smelled faintly of yesterday's coal fire and Mr. Prowse's polish. Dacre sat stiffly in the wooden chair, hands folded, though his long fingers twitched now and again as though an invisible keyboard lay before him. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. He had insisted on playing a hymn tune that morning, soft and halting, before Sergeant Rudd put a stop to it. Grief, some said. Guilt, others suggested. You gave her something, Hawthorne said without preamble. A throat lozenge, perhaps. Several of the guests noticed you handed her something before the performance. Dacre blinked. Yes, a lozenge. Ordinary enough for singers. She asked for it. I always keep them. What sort? Hawthorne pressed. Eucalyptus pastilles, Dacre said, fumbling at his pocket and producing a small tin. He opened it with shaking hands. Inside lay 3 brown discs, glossy with syrup. From the chemist. You may test them if you like. Hawthorne eyed the pastilles without touching them. Miss Whitcomb took one immediately. She slipped it into her mouth just before stepping on the stage, Dacre admitted. She said her throat was tight. He broke off and swallowed hard. Inspector, surely you don't think I would? Poisonous singer I had worked with for years. That remains to be seen, Hawthorne replied crisply. You travelled with her from London. You had access to her belongings. You quarrelled by your own admission. A motive might be financial. Resentment over money is common enough. Dacre spread his hands in a gesture of despair. She did hold the purse strings, yes. She was difficult. But I lived by her engagements. To harm her would be to ruin myself. Hawthorne's gaze did not soften. Men ruin themselves every day for reasons less practical. Sergeant Rudd, who stood by with notebook in hand, coughed. We found something, sir. In his valise. Dacre stiffened. What? Rudd produced a small vial, corked and half empty. The liquid inside was faintly yellow. This was under your shirt, sir. Dacre let out a hoarse sound. A tincture for nerves. Valerian, from the chemist. You may smell it. It is hardly poisonous. Hawthorne sniffed the vial. The sharp, herbal odor was unmistakable. He raised a brow at Rudd, but said nothing. We'll have it analyzed, he remarked, slipping it into his pocket. In the meantime, you'll remain at the inn. Do not attempt to leave. Dacre sank into his chair, muttering to himself. His fingers twitched across the air, soundless chords wrung from silence. At Langford House, Lady Clara was not long in hearing the village's verdict. She received the news with both relief and alarm, relief that suspicion might settle upon someone outside her circle, and alarm that a musician she had engaged should bring such disgrace upon her garden. She pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips and declared it all too dreadful. Beatrice, pale and thoughtful, said little. Her eyes followed Julian, who busied himself with estate accounts, but whose expression betrayed unease. He did not like suspicion pointing at others, nor did he enjoy the inspector's questions about his part in securing Miss Whitcomb's appearance. It was perfectly ordinary. Julian insisted to Hawthorne when summoned again. An agency in London, a recommendation from an acquaintance. I made the arrangements, paid the fee, and booked rooms at the Rose and Crown. Nothing more sinister than that. And this acquaintance? Hawthorne asked. Julian hesitated. An old school friend, now in the theatre world. He said Eleanor Whitcomb was eager for engagements. That was all. Hawthorne made a note. And you had no personal connection with her? None, Julian said firmly. His jaw tightened. I had never met her before, nor had Beatrice. Beatrice, standing by the mantel, looked down at her gloves. A stitch at the wrist had come loose again. She worried about it with her thumb, saying nothing. Meanwhile, Miss Marple went about her inquiries with her usual inconspicuous grace. She visited Mrs. Pratt at the haberdasher's, thread samples in hand. Mrs. Pratt's sharp eye confirmed what Miss Marple suspected. The silk used on Eleanor's gown did not come from her shop. "Not my stock, Miss Marple," she said, pursing her lips. "That's foreign, I'd wager. I've seen a similar twist in French imports, but I never stock them. Too fussy for village needs." Miss Marple nodded. "So Miss Whitcomb must have brought it herself. How very interesting. She was particular, that one," Mrs. Pratt said with relish. "And there's something in that hem, mark me. Ladies hide things. They always do." Miss Marple agreed softly. "And men too, Mrs. Pratt, only their stitches are of a different kind." On her way home, she paused at the Rose and Crown. Mabel, the maid, confided with the breathless eagerness of one who cannot keep a secret even when she wishes to. "I saw Mr. Dacre give her something," she whispered. "Not just the lozenge. Earlier, in her room." He handed her a folded paper. She hid it in her bodice as quickly as you like. When she left, she burnt something in the grate. Paper ashes, scattered fine. But there was a corner left, stuck under the great bar. It had numbers on it, miss. Columns of them. Miss Marple listened intently. Numbers. How very curious. Did anyone else go into her room? "Only the lady herself," Mabel said. "And once, Mr. Dacre for a moment. He knocked first. I was in the passage." She laughed, and he went in. Miss Marple thanked the girl with a kind word, and a shilling slipped into her hand. On the way out, she met Inspector Hawthorne, who was arriving to question the inn staff. He glanced at her, half amused, half irritated. "You are everywhere, Miss Marple." "Not everywhere," she said mildly. "But one does pick up stray threads when they appear. The trouble is, Inspector, people are too eager to seize the thick rope and ignore the little ends that dangle." He frowned. "Are you suggesting Dacre is not our man?" "I am suggesting," she replied, "that the truth of a matter often lies where no one is pointing." That afternoon, Hawthorne received the preliminary post-mortem report. It confirmed what suspicion had already whispered. Traces of a toxin in Eleanor Whitcomb's system, likely ingested shortly before her collapse. The substance was not common nor easily obtained. Its origin remained uncertain. Hawthorne read it with grim satisfaction. To his mind, the matter grew simpler. Dacre had handed her the lozenge. She had swallowed it. She had died. Cause and culprit aligned neatly, like files on a shelf. He called a small gathering at the inn's parlour. Lady Clara, Beatrice, Julian, Doctor, Penrose, and of course Dacre, pale and trembling. Sergeant Rudd stood by the door like a silent sentry. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hawthorne began, "the evidence points strongly to Mr. Dacre. He alone provided Miss Whitcomb with a pastille just before she sang. The post-mortem shows poison ingested moments earlier. A vial of unknown substance was found in his possession. His quarrels with her are known. It is, I think, abundantly clear." Dacre sprang to his feet. "No, I swear to you I did nothing. That lozenge was harmless." "Ask anyone. Ask the chemist, and the vial only valerian, nothing more." Lady Clara sniffed. "Such a disgraceful business." Beatrice glanced once at Julian, who stared firmly at the inspector, lips pressed in a hard line. Dr. Penrose folded his arms, troubled but silent. At the back of the room, Miss Marple sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not speak until Hawthorne paused for breath. "Inspector," she said gently, "I wonder, do you not find it odd that a woman so particular, so precise, would accept anything into her mouth before performing without absolute certainty of its safety? Singers guard their throats as misers guard their gold. To swallow something unexamined on the brink of song is most uncharacteristic." Hawthorne frowned. She asked for it. "So Mr. Dacre says. Miss Marple murmured. And perhaps she did. Yet her behavior elsewhere suggests she was careful. She carried her own silks, her own patterns, and her own secrets. She was not a woman who relied easily on others. It may be that the lozenge is important. Or it may be, and here her voice grew very soft, that it is precisely what we are meant to notice, while something else slips quietly by. A hush followed. Even Hawthorne, impatient though he was, seemed momentarily caught. Outside, the evening light slanted across the village roofs, and the church bell tolled the hour. Suspicion had found its first home in Lionel Dacre, but Miss Marple, watching the play of expression on each face in the room, suspected the true story had not yet begun to speak. The morning after Inspector Hawthorne's declaration, the village woke in the usual manner. Cocks crowing, kettles hissing, milk bottles clinking against front steps, yet beneath it all lingered a taut unease, like a curtain drawn across a room with something unpleasant behind it. People carried on with their errands, but conversations hushed when others passed, and the Rose and Crown became a hive of speculation rather than a place of rest. The whole of St. Mary Mead seemed to stand on tiptoe, waiting for the inspector to make the next move. Miss Marple, however, did not stand on tiptoe. She moved about her cottage in her calm, unhurried way, setting out a tray with a pot of tea and a slice of yesterday's seed cake. She had slept well enough, though she had spent some time before bed staring at the 2 short pieces of silk thread she had collected. One from Mrs. Larkin's spool, the other picked from her own shoe after the Soprano's collapse. To any ordinary eye, they were much alike, both fine and lustrous. Yet to Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime mending altar cloths and trimming petticoats, the difference was plain. One was darker, of a cooler tone, and twisted more tightly than the other. She had been pondering the matter while watering her geraniums when a knock came at the door. It was Beatrice Langford, pale and tired, her gloves clutched in one hand, her composure in the other. She began faltering. "I hardly know why I've come, Miss Marple, except that one can speak to you without feeling one is being made to give evidence." "Do come in, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, ushering her to a chair. "A little tea helps when things are muddled. You've had a very trying few days." Beatrice sipped obediently, her eyes downcast. "The inspector thinks it must be Mr. Dacre. Aunt Clara is satisfied. Julian says it is only a matter of time before they prove it." But her voice wavered. "I don't know what to think." "Not knowing is the beginning of wisdom," Miss Marple observed. "What is it that troubles you?" Beatrice hesitated, then slipped something from her reticule. A tiny scrap of paper, no larger than a postage stamp, signed at one corner. "I found this in the ashpan of our kitchen stove this morning. The maids had emptied the hearths, and this must have been overlooked. It looks like numbers, see?" Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the fragment. Indeed, faint pencil marks formed a column of figures, though incomplete: 17, 21, and 35, and then the edge was blackened away. "How very curious," she murmured. "Did you show this to Inspector Hawthorne?" Beatrice shook her head quickly. "Number. He would ask how it came into my hands, and Aunt Clara would be mortified. I thought perhaps it was nothing, but then I remembered what Mrs. Larkin said about Miss Whitcomb's paper with numbers. Could this have belonged to her? It may well have," Miss Marple said softly. "Figures, when stitched in patterns, can speak as surely as words. I once knew a young curate who kept track of his sermons by embroidering tiny marks on his handkerchiefs. No one else ever guessed." Beatrice managed a faint smile. "You always have a story, Miss Marple." "Life is made of stories, my dear. The trouble is, most of them are not told straight." Miss Marple folded the scrap neatly and slipped it into an envelope. "May I keep this safe for you?" "Yes, please," Beatrice said with relief. "And Miss Marple." She hesitated once more, her voice lowering. "Do you think Julian knows more than he admits?" He seemed so certain, so determined. When I asked him again about how he came to engage Miss Whitcomb, he grew cross. He said I ought not to concern myself. But I can't help feeling she looked at him strangely when she first arrived, as if she knew him. Miss Marple finished gently. Yes, I noticed that look too, but it may mean nothing. Appearances are a treacherous guide. Beatrice coloured and rose to go. Thank you for listening. I feel a little lighter now. When she had gone, Miss Marple sat very still, her fingers lightly brushing the envelope on the table. Numbers, a hem sewn in a peculiar pattern, and letters burnt in the grate. These were threads in a tapestry not yet revealed. But she could feel the outline beginning, like a sampler taking shape beneath a careful hand. Later that day, Inspector Hawthorne made his way to the vicarage to consult with Reverend Avery. Hawthorne liked clergymen. They heard more than the police ever did, and they kept confidences that could, with care, be teased into useful hints. Reverend Avery received him in his study, papers scattered, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose. "A dreadful business, Inspector," he said, shaking his head. "Mrs. Avery says the whole village is in uproar. There is nothing so unsettling as the idea that one of your neighbors might be capable of, well, poison." "Indeed," Hawthorne agreed. "Tell me, Reverend, had you any acquaintance with Miss Whitcomb?" "Only the briefest," the vicar replied. "She came to Evensong last Sunday." Sat quietly, but I could not help noticing she followed the service closely, as if every word mattered. Most visitors let their minds wander. She had an intensity about her. "Intensity," Hawthorne repeated. "Did she speak to anyone?" "To Mrs. Bickerton afterwards," Avery recalled. "About the hymn tune. Said it reminded her of someone she once knew. Mrs. Bickerton was delighted. Of course, she took it as a compliment to our modest choir." "Nothing more?" Hawthorne pressed. The vicar shook his head. "Only that she seemed burdened. A woman carrying more than her share." That phrase echoed what Dr. Penrose had said earlier, and it unsettled Hawthorne. He liked clear motives, jealousy, money, and spite. But burden was a vaguer thing, harder to pin down. That evening, Sergeant Rudd brought word that the ashes from Miss Whitcomb's grate had yielded a few scraps not entirely destroyed. Among them was half a page with more columns of numbers, carefully ruled as if copied from a ledger. Hawthorne frowned over it by lamplight. What the devil was she doing with accounts? Miss Marple, who happened to be present on the pretext of bringing Sergeant Rudd a jar of her blackberry jam, peered at the page with mild curiosity. "Figures often mean money, Inspector, or they may mean something else entirely. Prisoners in old tales used to send messages by numbers, a hymn book, a Bible page, and a line." Hawthorne gave her a keen look. "You think she was sending messages?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that people seldom stitch numbers into a hem unless they wish to carry them secretly. Letters can be intercepted, words can betray, but numbers sewn into silk, only another woman with a sharp eye for thread would notice, and perhaps the person was meant to notice." Hawthorne leaned back. "Then the question is, who was the message for?" "Exactly," Miss Marple murmured, "and who might wish her silenced before she could deliver it." The following day brought a new development. Julian North, returning from the estate office, was stopped by Sergeant Rudd at the gates. "Inspector Hawthorne would like a word with you, sir. Some questions about accounts." "Accounts?" Julian frowned. "I know nothing of Miss Whitcomb's affairs." "Nevertheless," Rudd said, "we've reason to think she had figures from some ledger. The inspector wonders how she came by them." Julian's face tightened, but he said nothing more, striding toward the house with forced composure. Beatrice, watching from the window, felt her heart lurch. Something unspoken pressed between them now, heavier than any spoken word. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her lamp, knitting in her lap, though the needles were idle. She thought of the numbers, of the foreign silk, of Eleanor Whitcomb's insistence that the hem be altered in haste. She thought, too, of the look that had passed between Julian and the soprano, swift and charged. On the table lay Beatrice's scrap of paper, safe in its envelope. Miss Marple took it out once more, comparing it to the larger fragment from the inn's grate. The handwriting matched. Someone, Eleanor herself or another, had been copying numbers with care. Why destroy them unless afraid they might be found? And why sew them into a hem unless determined they must not be lost? Outside, the village settled into uneasy sleep. Yet within Miss Marple's quiet cottage, the old lady's eyes gleamed with thought. She did not yet know the whole pattern, but she had found the hidden clue that would begin to unravel it. The numbers were no idle scribble, but a code stitched into silk by a woman who had run out of safer hiding places. Inspector Hawthorne was not a man to linger over mysteries when a practical explanation could be forced into place. Yet by the 6th day after Eleanor Whitcomb's death, the investigation had grown thornier than he liked. The poison was confirmed to be a rare compound, not sold in local shops. The figures in the burnt scraps suggested hidden dealings of a financial nature, and everywhere he turned, the whispers of the village seemed to echo with implication. Suspicion had not left Lionel Dacre, but it had begun to brush others too, like a cloak caught on hedges. At Langford House, Lady Clara attempted to restore order with elaborate breakfasts and carefully pressed linen. But conversation at her table never strayed far from the tragedy, no matter how she tried to direct it toward roses or estate matters. On one such morning, Inspector Hawthorne paid a visit and found the household on edge. Beatrice sat stiffly, her plate untouched, while Julian North leafed through estate ledgers with unusual vigor, as though the figures themselves might defend him. Lady Clara, in lavender silk, offered a brittle smile. "I trust, Inspector, you are near to concluding matters," she said. "The village grows restless. People avoid the high street as though guilt clings to us." "I am nearer, Lady Clara," Hawthorne said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words. "But there are questions that must be answered." He turned his gaze to Julian. "Mr. North, I understand you are responsible for the Langford accounts. Tell me, have there been irregularities?" Julian's jaw tightened. Every estate has small irregularities. Rents delayed, repairs postponed. Nothing beyond the ordinary. "Yet Miss Whitcomb had numbers in her possession," Hawthorne pressed. "Figures that resemble account columns. How would an opera singer come by such information?" Julian set the ledger down with a snap. "I cannot say, unless someone showed her. But why she would interest herself in our estate affairs is beyond me." Beatrice's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup. Miss Marple, who had been invited at Lady Clara's insistence ostensibly to lend her soothing presence, noticed the tremor and the faint glance Beatrice cast toward her fiancé. It was a look of both worry and doubt, the sort of look young women give when they wish desperately to believe, yet know belief comes at a cost. "Sometimes," Miss Marple said gently, "people acquire knowledge they were never meant to have. I've known servants to overhear, children to glimpse papers, and visitors to observe more than their hosts realize. A singer, especially one in need of protection, might value such knowledge very dearly." Lady Clara stiffened. Protection? What protection would she need here? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled mildly. "One never knows, Lady Clara. The world is not as safe as our gardens pretend." The inspector closed his notebook with a snap. "Mr. North, you will make your ledgers available for inspection. Transparency is the best path, I assure you." Julian flushed, but he gave a short nod. "As you wish, Inspector." That afternoon, gossip ran like quicksilver through the village. At Mrs. Bickerton's butcher shop, customers whispered that Julian North had been caught altering accounts. At the haberdasher's, Mrs. Pratt declared that the soprano had been blackmailing him. At the vicarage, Mrs. Avery confided to her husband that she had seen Beatrice in tears near the churchyard, which could only mean she doubted her fiancé's innocence. Miss Marple, making her way down the high street with her knitting basket, allowed the whispers to drift around her like leaves in the breeze. She had no need to ask questions. People volunteered them readily when they thought she was not listening. By the time she returned home, she carried not only her purchases, but also a fair sketch of the village mood. Suspicion had shifted, as it often did, from the stranger to the neighbor. Lionel Dacre was still under a cloud, but now Julian North stood in the same shadow. That evening, Beatrice came again to Miss Marple's cottage. Her cheeks were flushed from walking, her eyes red-rimmed. "I cannot bear it," she said, sinking into a chair. "Everyone whispers about Julian. They say he may have been entangled with Miss Whitcomb. They say she held something over him, and he grows shorter with me each day, as though I am to blame." Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea. "And what do you believe, my dear?" Beatrice twisted her gloves in her lap. "I want to believe him. I love him." But I cannot dismiss the way she looked at him that first moment, as if she knew him, and he avoided her eyes. "Love does not blind us," Miss Marple said kindly. "It makes us notice more. That is why it hurts so much." Beatrice's tears spilled over. "If it is, I cannot bear it," she said, sinking into a chair. "Everyone whispers about Julian. They say he may have been entangled with Miss Whitcomb. They say she held something over him, and he grows shorter with me each day, as though I am to blame." Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea. "And what do you believe, my dear?" Beatrice twisted her gloves in her lap. "I want to believe him. I love him." But I cannot dismiss the way she looked at him that first moment, as if she knew him, and he avoided her eyes. "Love does not blind us," Miss Marple said kindly. "It makes us notice more. That is why it hurts so much." Beatrice's tears spilled over. "If it is true, if she held some secret with him, I do not know what I shall do." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Courage, my dear. Secrets have a way of rising, like cream in milk. Better to let them rise than to let them sour." Meanwhile, Inspector Hawthorne pursued another lead. He summoned Lionel Dacre once more to the inn's parlor, setting the vial of valerian tincture on the table before him. "You claim this is harmless," Hawthorne said. "Yet analysis shows it could mask the bitter taste of poison. Explain that, Mr. Dacre." Dacre's eyes widened in horror. "Masking bitterness? I never considered such a thing. I swear to you, Inspector, it is merely for my nerves. Ask the chemist. He will vouch for me." "She held some secret with him. I do not know what I shall do." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Courage, my dear. Secrets have a way of rising, like cream in milk. Better to let them rise than to let them sour." Meanwhile, Inspector Hawthorne pursued another lead. He summoned Lionel Dacre once more to the inn's parlor, setting the vial of valerian tincture on the table before him. "You claim this is harmless," Hawthorne said. "Yet analysis shows it could mask the bitter taste of poison. Explain that, Mr. Dacre." Dacre's eyes widened in horror. "Masking bitterness? I never considered such a thing. I swear to you, Inspector, it is merely for my nerves. Ask the chemist. He will vouch for me." "Perhaps," Hawthorne said coldly. "But you are the last man known to give her something, and she is dead." "I gave her a pastry," Dacre cried. "If poison was in her, it came from elsewhere. She laughed at me and said she had found a way to be safe. Does that sound like a woman who suspected her accompanist of treachery?" Hawthorne's expression softened only slightly. "You are not released from suspicion, Mr. Dacre, but I will admit there may be more than one thread to this." The next morning, Dr. Penrose came forward with information of his own. He visited Inspector Hawthorne at the constable's office, hat in hand. "There is something I must tell you," he said gravely. Last month, Miss Whitcomb consulted me in confidence. She complained of palpitations and dizziness. I examined her and found nothing definite, but she was clearly anxious. She asked if certain herbs might affect the heart. At the time, I thought it was nerve-wracking. Now, well, I cannot help but wonder if she feared poison even then. Hawthorne seized on this, so she expected it. She feared someone would try to kill her. "It seems possible," Penrose said. "But she made me swear to secrecy. I break that oath only because she is dead, and justice demands it." When Hawthorne relayed this to Miss Marple later that day, she listened intently, her needles moving steadily. "How very curious," she murmured. If she feared poison, why accept anything at all from Mr. Dacre's hand? Unless she thought the danger came from elsewhere. "From whom, then?" Hawthorne demanded. Miss Marple glanced up with her mild smile. "That, Inspector, is what we must discover. But I fancy the answer lies in those numbers she stitched into her hem. Numbers seldom lie, though men often do." That evening, an unexpected confrontation occurred at Langford House. Lady Clara had retired early, leaving Beatrice and Julian alone in the drawing-room. The air between them was taut as wire. "You must tell me the truth," Beatrice said suddenly, her voice trembling. "What was Miss Whitcomb to you?" Julian's head jerked up. "Nothing. I have said so." "Then why did she look at you so strangely?" Beatrice pressed. "And why are you so certain she meant to harm you?" Julian rose sharply, pacing before the hearth. "Because she had figures, Bea. Figures from the estate accounts. She meant to accuse me of mismanagement, of theft perhaps. I do not know how she came by them, but she did. If the inspector digs, he will find delays and arrears things that look worse than they are. She could have ruined me." Beatrice gasped. "So it is true there were irregularities?" "Nothing criminal," Julian cried. "Only adjustments to keep the estate afloat." "Your aunt spends lavishly, Bea. Repairs, entertainments, charities. I shifted funds, yes, but to keep the books balanced. Miss Whitcomb must have learned of it somehow. She threatened to break off, biting his lip." "She threatened you," Beatrice whispered. Julian sank into a chair, covering his face with his hands. "She said she would expose me unless I agreed to certain terms. I refused, and now she is dead. Can you not see how damning that is?" Beatrice pressed her hand to her mouth, stricken. "Julian, did you know?" he cried. "I swear to you, Bea, I did not harm her, but the inspector will never believe me." Unbeknownst to them, Lady Clara stood just beyond the door, her hand tightening on the knob. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She had heard enough to know that her household was enmeshed in a scandal deeper than she had feared. That night, Miss Marple sat by her lamp once more, the silk threads laid out before her. She thought of Julian's confession, of Beatrice's torn loyalties, and of Lady Clara's brittle pride. She thought, too, of Lionel Dacre's despair and Dr. Penrose's uneasy conscience. Secrets had begun to surface, each darker than the last, but beneath them all ran the code in the Soprano's hem, quiet and insistent, numbers stitched into silk as a message meant to survive her. Miss Marple suspected that when the pattern was fully read, it would point not to the obvious suspect, but to the one person who had hoped all eyes would look elsewhere. For now, the village buzzed with confrontation and fear, but in Miss Marple's quiet sitting room, the old lady smiled faintly. Human nature, she knew, was the most revealing code of all. The 7th day after Eleanor Whitcomb's sudden death dawned grey and unsettled, as though the weather itself shared in the village's unease. Clouds hung low over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, and a mist clung to the hedgerows, blurring the outlines of familiar things. People went about their business more quickly than usual, eyes darting to neighbors, whispers floating like smoke. The case had grown thick with rumor, and even the most innocent gestures, an unopened letter, a glance exchanged, were imbued with suspicion. Inspector Hawthorne felt the weight of expectation pressing on him. The villagers wanted resolution, not complexity. Yet every time he believed he had his hand on the culprit, another detail slid loose. He had prepared himself to press harder on Julian North, whose confession of adjustments in the estate accounts had shaken Beatrice's faith. But before he could act, another disturbance came that threw the matter into new confusion. It was Sergeant Rudd who brought the news. He came into the inspector's temporary office, cap in hand, his face grave. "Sir," he said, "we've had a burglary." "At the Rose and Crown?" Hawthorne's head snapped up. "A burglary?" Rudd nodded. "Miss Whitcomb's room, sir. Someone forced the lock in the night. Mr. Prowse discovered it this morning. Drawers pulled out, trunk overturned. The odd thing is, not much seems to be taken. Except, yes?" Hawthorne demanded. "Except the gown," Rudd said. "The ivory silk she wore at the garden party. It's gone." Hawthorne swore under his breath. "The gown, the hem." "Just so," Rudd said quietly. The inspector went at once to the inn. Miss Marple, who had been on her way to the baker's, altered her route with discreet efficiency and arrived shortly after, her knitting basket resting innocently on her arm. Mr. Prowse met them both at the door, flustered and red-faced. "Terrible business, Inspector. I pride myself on keeping a respectable house. Burglary under my roof? Why, it will be the ruin of us." "Never mind your reputation," Hawthorne said sharply. "Show me the room." They climbed the stairs to the chamber Eleanor Whitcomb had occupied. It was in disarray, drawers yanked open, garments scattered, and the trunk upended. On the floor lay a half-burned candle, as if someone had worked in the dark and then fled. Hawthorne bent to examine the lock. "Forced from outside," he muttered. "A simple tool. Whoever did this knew what they were after." Miss Marple, meanwhile, stooped to pick up a small object lying by the skirting board. She held it delicately in her fingers, a broken needle, bent and snapped. "How careless," she murmured. Or perhaps how hurried. Hawthorne glanced at it with irritation. Needles mean little. "On the contrary," Miss Marple said softly. "One can tell a great deal from a broken needle, whether it's snapped from clumsiness, or from strain, or from being used for something not quite intended. It is much like people, Inspector. They break in different ways and for different reasons." Hawthorne chose not to pursue the metaphor. "The gown is gone. That proves it. Someone knew the hem contained something, and someone was desperate to conceal it. Or to recover it," Miss Marple suggested. "One must not assume concealment is always the goal. Sometimes the gown may hold salvation as well as ruin." Hawthorne gave her a sharp look. "You know more than you say, Miss Marple." She smiled mildly. Only what anyone could observe if they cared to look. By midday, word of the burglary had spread throughout the village. Mrs. Bickerton told her customers that the gown had been spirited away by London gangsters, no less. Mrs. Pratt declared it was surely Julian North, desperate to destroy evidence of his fiddled accounts. At the vicarage, Mrs. Avery wondered if poor Mr. Dacre had crept up in the night, for guilt makes men restless. Every theory found eager listeners, and each added to the confusion. At Langford House, the news struck Lady Clara like a blow. She sat upright in her chair, her face pale, her hands trembling on her gloves. "Stolen," she cried when Inspector Hawthorne brought the report. "From under our very noses. That gown was the key. Everyone said so. Without it, how will you ever prove the case?" "We will find it," Hawthorne assured her. "No one can spirit away silk without a trace. Someone local has it. The roads are watched." Beatrice sat silent, her eyes downcast. Julian paced the room in agitation. "This is monstrous," he muttered. "First her death, now this. It will never end." Lady Clara turned her gaze sharply upon him. You speak as though you have something to fear, Julian. Julian flushed, then bowed his head. We all have something to fear, Lady Clara. Scandal touches everyone. Miss Marple, who had accompanied the inspector, sat quietly in a corner, her knitting in her lap. She observed the play of expression across each face, the fear in Beatrice's eyes, the pride in Lady Clara's bearing, and the defensive anger in Julian's stance. It was a tableau, and like all tableaus, it revealed more than it meant to. Later that day, a curious thing occurred. Mabel, the maid at the Rose and Crown, appeared at Miss Marple's cottage, shyly twisting her apron. Please, Miss Marple. I thought you ought to know, she whispered. I found this in the passage outside Miss Whitcomb's room. I didn't dare tell the inspector. Not yet. From her pocket, she produced a small scrap of ivory silk, torn roughly from a seam. Along the edge ran tiny stitches, uneven and hurried, as though someone had tried to pick them apart in haste. Between the threads, faint pencil marks showed numbers, partly smudged, but still legible. Miss Marple examined it with keen eyes. How very interesting. Thank you, Mabel. You have done quite right. Will you tell the inspector? Mabel asked anxiously. In good time, Miss Marple said gently. But sometimes it is wise to hold a clue a little while, until one knows who should hear it. When Mabel had gone, Miss Marple laid the silk beside her other threads. The pattern was clearer now the numbers had been sewn in deliberately, each stitch corresponding to a figure. The hem was not mere decoration. It was a code indeed, a code someone was desperate to erase. That evening, Inspector Hawthorne gathered the principal figures once more at the inn. Lady Clara, Beatrice, Julian, Lionel Dacre, and Dr. Penrose. He announced the burglary, his eyes scanning their faces. The gown is missing, he said gravely, which tells us one thing clearly. Someone here feared what it contained. Fear is as good as guilt in my book. A murmur ran through the group. Lady Clara gasped. Beatrice's hand flew to her throat. Julian's eyes flashed. Dacre moaned softly, and Dr. Penrose frowned. You cannot mean, Dacre stammered, that I stole it. I've been watching it night and day. Have you? Hawthorne said coldly. A man may slip out while others sleep. Julian spoke sharply. If you're determined to blame Dacre for everything, Inspector, you may miss the truth. And what truth would you suggest, Mr. North? Hawthorne asked. Julian hesitated, then said that someone else in this room had more to lose than an accompanist. All eyes turned. Lady Clara stiffened, her chin rising. Do you dare imply? But before the quarrel could deepen, Miss Marple's soft voice cut across the room. Gentlemen, ladies, forgive me. But I think we are forgetting one important thing. Burglars who search in haste rarely leave without disturbing more than their target. Yet in this case, only the gown was taken. That suggests not a common thief, but someone who knew precisely what they sought. And if they knew that, then they must also have known about them. There was silence. Each person shifted uncomfortably, for knowledge of the hem was not common. Only a handful of people had heard Mrs. Larkin mention it. Miss Marple let the silence settle before continuing, her tone mild. The question, then, is not only who had reason to fear what the hem concealed, but who had knowledge of it at all. That narrows our field considerably. Hawthorne frowned, recognizing the logic but unwilling to concede it openly. Perhaps. But knowledge spreads quickly in a village. Not as quickly as you think, Miss Marple said. Gossip spreads, yes, but true detail remains rare. And I fancy the person who took the gown knows more detail than most. She let her words sink in, then returned to her knitting. Hawthorne dismissed the gathering soon after, but unease lingered in the air. Each person left with the sense that suspicion had widened once more, circling them all. That night, as the village settled into uneasy slumber, Miss Marple placed the torn scrap of silk into her workbox. The burglary had shifted the case, twisting it into new shapes. What had seemed a straightforward matter of poison and quarrel was now entangled with hidden codes, stolen garments, and secrets that reached into the very heart of Langford House. She sat back in her chair, the lamplight casting long shadows across her quiet sitting room. Somewhere in those numbers lay the truth of Eleanor Whitcomb's death. But until the gown itself or its missing pieces resurfaced, the code remained unfinished, the pattern incomplete. Yet Miss Marple felt no impatience. Human nature, she knew, was like a tapestry. The threads could not help but pull toward the design, however tangled the weaver's hand. And sooner or later, the design would reveal itself. The burglary at the Rose and Crown had unsettled the entire village. It was one thing for a soprano to collapse dramatically at a garden party. It was quite another for her belongings to vanish from under the noses of the constabulary. Fear had crept in like damp. Doors were locked earlier in the evening, curtains were drawn tightly, and even the most chatty of neighbors lowered their voices when passing along speculation. Yet, despite the inspector's stern warnings, no one seemed any closer to the truth. Inspector Hawthorne grew increasingly impatient. "We cannot let this drag on, Rudd," he muttered as they walked the high street. A week gone, and still no resolution. A missing gown, numbers no one can explain, and every villager with a theory. The chief constable will expect results. "Yes, sir." Sergeant Rudd agreed, though he added thoughtfully, "It's a slippery sort of case, isn't it? Nothing seems to stay where it's put." Hawthorne frowned. "That's exactly what I dislike. Facts should remain facts. If they don't, it's because someone's twisting them." Meanwhile, Miss Marple was in her garden, clipping dead roses and listening to the quiet talk that flowed more freely when people believed her occupied with her flowers. She heard that Beatrice Langford had been weeping again, that Julian North had been seen walking late near the mill stream, that Lionel Dacre had spent the afternoon at the chemist's, buying more pastilles as if to prove their innocence. She tucked each remark into her mind like a stitch, forming a pattern others did not see. She had already concluded that the case would not be solved by ledgers or even by the gown itself, but by the human heart. People always revealed themselves not in words, but in the small cracks where pride, fear, or guilt seeped through. All that was needed was the right nudge at the right moment, and so she devised a little test. The opportunity presented itself 2 evenings later at Langford House, where Lady Clara insisted on a small gathering to restore normalcy. She invited the inspector, Dr. Penrose and his wife, Lionel Dacre, under watchful eye, and, naturally, Miss Marple. Beatrice and Julian were present, though the strain between them hung as clearly as the lamps lit across the drawing-room. Lady Clara, determined to preserve appearances, directed the servants to bring out sherry and cakes as though a return to ordinary civility might undo the whispers of scandal. Miss Marple sat quietly near the hearth, knitting in hand, though her needles barely moved. She let the conversation flow, Lady Clara praising her roses, Dr. Penrose speaking of parish ailments, and Lionel Dacre protesting his innocence in half-finished sentences. She waited until the moment was right, until the room had settled into a fragile rhythm, and then, with apparent casualness, she spoke. "I was thinking," she said softly, as though to herself, "how very curious it is that the hem was sewn with numbers. I once saw something similar in a parish sampler, a message hidden in plain sight. Of course, such things are dangerous, for once the code is broken, the truth lies bare. And when the gown reappears, and it will, why then, the entire story will be plain to see." There was a pause. Lady Clara blinked rapidly. Beatrice's lips parted, her eyes darting toward Julian. Dr. Penrose frowned at his hands. Lionel Dacre paled, muttering, "It was never mine." But it was Julian whose reaction betrayed him most clearly. He started, his jaw tightening, his hand clenching around the stem of his glass until it nearly cracked. He forced a laugh a moment later, but it came too late, strained and false. Miss Marple lowered her gaze back to her knitting, as though she had noticed nothing. Later that night, after the guests had gone, Beatrice sought Miss Marple in the hall. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "You did that on purpose. You spoke of the gown to see how they would react." Miss Marple smiled gently. "People tell the truth best when they do not mean to, my dear. One must only give them the occasion." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. "Julian knows more than he admits, doesn't he?" "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "it is very hard for a young man, proud and honorable in his own way, to admit he has placed himself in a compromising situation. But whether his sin is folly or wickedness, that is the question yet to be answered." Inspector Hawthorne, too, had noticed Julian's reaction, though he attributed it to nerves. "The fellow's guilty of something," he told Sergeant Rudd later. "Falsified accounts at the very least, but murder is something that I still cannot pin." Miss Marple, however, thought otherwise. It was not only Julian's reaction that had caught her attention. It was Lady Clara's faint gasp, so quickly smothered, and the way her fingers twisted in her lap when she thought no one was looking. Pride can hide much, but hands often betray what lips refuse to speak. The next morning, Miss Marple took a quiet walk to Mrs. Larkin's shop. She carried with her the torn scrap of silk Mabel had found in the passage. Mrs. Larkin examined it closely, nodding. "Yes, that's my stitching, though it's been picked at roughly. Not by me, mind you. Whoever tore this was no seamstress." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "Tell me, Mrs. Larkin, when Miss Whitcomb stood over you that morning, guiding your hand, did she seem fearful or determined?" "Both," Mrs. Larkin said after a moment's thought. "Fearful that she might be followed, but determined to see the work done. She said once, 'If they find it, they will not understand.' I thought she meant the hemline." "How very enlightening," Miss Marple murmured. "People often say more than they intend." When she returned home, she placed the scrap of silk beside her threads and fragments. Slowly, the numbers began to take shape in her mind, though she had not yet deciphered them fully. It was enough to know that Eleanor Whitcomb had died not merely for vanity, nor even for jealousy, but for knowledge, knowledge sewn into silk, knowledge someone feared desperately would come to light. That evening, Miss Marple prepared for her final little experiment. She invited Beatrice to tea, knowing the girl would come willingly, and asked her to bring Julian. To her surprise, Lady Clara accompanied them, declaring she could not allow her niece to wander about unchaperoned when scandal hung so thick. Miss Marple received them with her usual sweetness, serving seed cake and tea in her cozy parlour. As they sat, she directed the conversation with the same subtlety a seamstress uses when drawing a thread. She asked about roses, about London, and about the war years. And then, quite suddenly, she leaned forward and said in her mildest voice, "It is such a comfort to know the gown will soon be recovered. The constable tells me a search has already yielded promising clues. Once the hem is examined, the whole matter will be solved. For the numbers will show exactly who profited from deceit and who had the most to lose from exposure." Julian shifted uneasily, his face pale. Beatrice reached for his hand, but found it cold. Lady Clara's teacup rattled sharply against its saucer, though she tried to smile. How very droll, Miss Marple," she said, her voice too bright. "But surely you don't imagine a gown could reveal such dreadful things?" "Oh, but it can," Miss Marple replied softly. "A gown can carry more than a woman's pride. It can carry her secret, and those secrets, once revealed, will point directly to the person who feared them most." Silence fell. Lady Clara set down her cup with trembling fingers. Julian opened his mouth to speak, then thought better of it Beatrice, her face stricken, looked from one to the other, sensing more than she understood. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. She had seen enough. The final test was complete. The reactions of those present had told her everything she needed. The code sewn into the soprano's hem might require time to decipher fully, but human nature had already given her the answer. All that remained was to draw the pattern together and to reveal at the right moment the name of the one who had killed Eleanor Whitcomb. But that moment had not yet come. For now, she smiled serenely and asked if anyone would care for another slice of seed cake, as though her parlour were no more than the stage for ordinary village hospitality and not the quiet theatre of revelation. The following morning broke bright and brittle, as if the sun itself meant to sweep away the fog of doubt that had hung over St. Mary Mead for more than a week. Birds sang vigorously in the hedges. Children darted along the lanes to school, and the church bell chimed with brisk cheer. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds of village life pulsed a deep anticipation. Word had spread quickly that Inspector Hawthorne had called for a final meeting at Langford House. Something decisive, everyone felt, was about to occur. Miss Marple, dressed as she always did, in her neat grey cardigan and sensible shoes, with her knitting basket looped comfortably over her arm. She walked to Langford House with an air of mild serenity, though inside her mind was sharper than the edge of a new needle. She had watched, she had listened, she had laid her little tests, and now the pattern was as plain to her as a sampler on a schoolroom wall. The drawing-room at Langford House had been arranged with unusual solemnity. Chairs stood in a half-circle, the curtains drawn back to admit the brisk daylight. Inspector Hawthorne sat at a small writing table, Sergeant Rudd beside him, his notebook open. Lady Clara, regal yet drawn, presided from her armchair. Beatrice sat close to her aunt, pale but composed, her eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. Julian North stood stiffly near the mantel, as though bracing himself against unseen winds. Lionel Dacre slumped in another chair, his fingers twitching as though still playing chords in the air. Dr. Penrose and his wife were also present, drawn by duty and curiosity alike. Hawthorne cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've gathered you here to bring this unhappy matter to its conclusion. The investigation has revealed many secrets, more than I care to recount. But one truth is now unavoidable. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb was poisoned. The poison was administered shortly before her performance at Lady Clara's garden party. At first, all evidence pointed to Mr. Dacre. He admits to giving her a pastille, and he possessed a suspicious vial. But, and here Hawthorne glanced at Miss Marple with a slight, reluctant smile, others have persuaded me that the matter is not so simple. All eyes turned to Miss Marple. She sat, quietly, her hands folded, her expression mild. After a pause, she spoke. "Inspector Hawthorne is correct," she said gently. "It was not so simple. The truth lay not in what was given openly, but in what was hidden in what was sown, rather than swallowed. Eleanor Whitcomb feared for her life. She knew someone sought to silence her, and so she carried her secret in her gown, stitched into the hem where no one would think to look. Numbers, copied carefully, that told of deception and mismanagement. She believed, poor soul, that if harm befell her, the secret would remain to accuse the guilty." Julian shifted uneasily. Lady Clara's hands tightened on her lap. Miss Marple's eyes, kind but piercing, moved from one face to the next. "The numbers were no random figures," Miss Marple continued. "They were from the Langford estate accounts. Miss Whitcomb had obtained them somehow, perhaps by chance, perhaps by correspondence with someone who wished her to know. They revealed discrepancies. Funds moved in ways not easily explained. To most, it would seem dull, but to one whose livelihood depended on the Langford estate, it was dangerous indeed." Julian's face flushed. "I told you," he burst out. "I made adjustments only to keep the estate afloat." There was nothing criminal. Miss Marple inclined her head. Perhaps not criminal, Mr. North, but sufficient to ruin your prospects, should they become public. And Miss Whitcomb threatened exposure, did she not? You admitted as much. Julian's mouth opened, then closed again. Beatrice turned stricken eyes upon him, yet Miss Marple went on gently. It was not you who silenced her. The room stirred. Lady Clara let out a faint sound, half gasp, half sob. Miss Marple's gaze rested on her now, not accusing but inexorable. Lady Clara, you feared scandal more than anything. You saw your household, your name, and your niece's future all imperiled by this woman who appeared suddenly with knowledge she could not possibly have had by honest means. You invited her into your garden, hoping perhaps to keep matters under control. But when you saw she would not be controlled, you acted. You slipped a measure of poison into her broth earlier that evening, before the performance, knowing she would sip it quietly in her room. You relied upon her collapse to seem natural, or at worst, upon suspicion falling upon her accompanist. And indeed, suspicion did. Lady Clara sat frozen, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. At last she whispered, "You cannot prove it." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "But it is already proven. Your burglary, Lady Clara, was too clumsy. You sent someone, perhaps even went yourself, to take the gown from the inn. Only you knew from Mrs. Larkin's account that the hem contained numbers. Only you had the fear of what those numbers might reveal about your estate. Others suspected you knew, and when you tried to pick the stitches apart, you left a broken needle behind. A housekeeper of your standing would never have left such disorder unless driven by desperation." Beatrice turned to her aunt, horror dawning in her face. "Aunt Clara, is it true?" Lady Clara's composure cracked. She rose unsteadily to her feet, her fine silk rustling. "I did it for you," she cried. "For you, Beatrice, for Julian. Do you not see? That woman would have destroyed everything, your good name, your future. She was nothing but a voice that had already faded. I could not allow her to bring ruin upon us." Her voice broke. She sank back into her chair, covering her face with trembling hands. Silence followed, heavy and unbroken. Then Beatrice let out a sob and buried her face in her hands. Julian stood rigid, his face pale as death. Lionel Dacre, startled beyond words, muttered prayers under his breath. Dr. Penrose looked gravely at the inspector. Inspector Hawthorne rose. His voice, when he spoke, was firm, but not unkind. "Lady Clara Langford, I must place you under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Whitcomb." Lady Clara did not resist. She sat motionless, her face hidden, as though her grand bearing had at last collapsed under the weight of her pride. The gathering broke slowly, like a play whose actors had forgotten their final bow. Beatrice remained by the hearth, tears running silently down her cheeks. Julian tried to comfort her, but she turned from him, her trust shattered as much by his concealments as by her aunt's crime. Lionel Dacre slipped away quietly, a man reprieved yet hollow. Dr. Penrose led his wife gently from the room, speaking of the frailty of human hearts. Miss Marple, as unobtrusively as she had come, gathered her knitting basket and made her way to the door. Inspector Hawthorne caught her there, his expression a curious blend of respect and chagrin. "You saw it long before I did," he admitted. "How?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One learns a great deal from sewing circles, Inspector. A hem tells you more about its owner than a diary might, and pride always breaks its thread in the end." He inclined his head. "I shall remember that." Miss Marple stepped out into the sunlight, the gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes. The village was already stirring with whispers of the arrest, but she paid them little heed. Human nature, she knew, was the same everywhere. Pride, fear, love and folly woven together in patterns that always, in time, revealed themselves. As she walked back to her cottage, the breeze stirred her garden roses. She paused to straighten a bloom, her hand steady, her face serene. Another tragedy had been resolved, another secret stitched and unstitched, and yet the quiet life of St. Mary Mead would go on, as it always did. Behind every curtain, every hedge, every teacup, lay the eternal mystery of human nature, and that, Miss Marple reflected, was the most inexhaustible code of all. The arrest of Lady Clara Langford shook St. Mary Mead like an unexpected storm. Though the sun rose and the shops opened as they always did, a sense of disbelief clung to the village. People spoke in hushed tones, peering from doorways as if the mere utterance of Lady Clara's name might summon scandal. For Lady Clara had been, in many eyes, the epitome of order, of dignity, of noble bearing. That such a woman could commit murder at her own garden party, no less, was almost beyond comprehension. At the Rose and Crown, Mr. Prowse repeated the story endlessly, polishing the same corner of the bar until it gleamed like glass. Mrs. Bickerton declared that she had never trusted Lady Clara's airs of superiority, and that pride had brought her down at last. Mrs. Pratt, of the haberdashers, insisted she had always suspected the hem of that gown held a wicked secret and felt vindicated in her judgment. The vicar's wife, however, took a more charitable view, remarking that desperation can twist even the most respectable souls into dreadful shapes. The gossip was not merely condemnation, it was fascination, for the villagers, having lived in the orbit of Langford House for so long, now saw its grandeur shadowed by shame. At Langford House itself, silence reigned. Beatrice moved through the rooms like a ghost, her once bright laughter silenced, her confidence broken. She could not reconcile the aunt who had raised her with the woman who had poured poison into another's broth. Julian, meanwhile, was equally haunted. Though he had not struck the fatal blow, he knew his financial manipulations had provided the spark that ignited Lady Clara's desperate act. He tried, with awkward gentleness, to comfort Beatrice, but she often turned away, needing solitude more than sympathy. The engagement, once so bright with promise, now hung by a thread. Inspector Hawthorne busied himself with the practicalities of the case. There were statements to be written, reports to be sent, and arrangements to be made for Lady Clara's removal to county custody. Yet for all his diligence, he remained troubled. "I should have seen it sooner, Rudd," he admitted to his sergeant as they walked back from Langford House. "She was so obvious," once pointed out, "and yet I let myself be distracted by Dacre's nervousness, by North's evasions, by every false scent laid before me." Sergeant Rudd, loyal and steady, replied, "We got there in the end, sir, with a little help." Hawthorne allowed himself a rueful smile. "Yes, with Miss Marple. She sees the truth in people's faces while I'm still chasing their words." Meanwhile, Lionel Dacre lingered in the village for a few more days, a free man yet deeply unsettled. He had been ready to shoulder blame, to accept his ruin, and now found himself reprieved without triumph. When Miss Marple encountered him outside the churchyard, he looked weary, his hands trembling slightly. "I suppose I should thank you, Miss Marple," he said, attempting a smile. "Without you, I might have been hanged for another's crime." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "You must not speak so darkly, Mr. Dacre. You were never truly guilty, only unfortunate. But perhaps this is a chance for you to begin anew, away from shadows that cling too closely." He nodded slowly. "Perhaps, though I fear I have lost more than I know how to recover." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "Loss is never the end. It is the beginning of something different, though we seldom see it at first." A week later, the village began to settle once more into its familiar rhythm. The market stalls returned to their chatter, the church choir rehearsed hymns, and the children laughed in the lanes as though nothing dreadful had ever occurred. Yet the memory of Eleanor Whitcomb's voice still lingered in the minds of those who had heard it that afternoon, soaring across the garden before being silenced forever. People spoke of her now with pity and sometimes admiration, though she had been a stranger. In her death, she had become part of the village's story. Miss Marple, in her quiet cottage, resumed her ordinary routines. She attended church, tended her garden, and entertained the vicar's wife for tea. Yet behind her serene exterior, she reflected deeply on the case. It was not only the crime itself that had troubled her, but the motives that lay beneath it. Lady Clara had killed not for gain, nor from hatred, but from pride and fear of scandal. She had convinced herself she acted to protect her niece and her household, yet in truth she had destroyed the very things she meant to preserve. Such, Miss Marple mused, was the irony of human nature. In grasping to save what we love, we often crush it. Beatrice visited Miss Marple one afternoon, her face pale but composed. She carried no gloves, no embroidery, nothing to occupy her hands, as though she had come simply to unburden herself. "I do not know what to do, Miss Marple," she confessed. "I loved my aunt, yet now I see her as a stranger. And Julian, I cannot bear to look at him the same way, knowing what he concealed, even if he did not kill. How can one live with such broken trust?" Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea, her manner gentle. "Trust, my dear, is like fine china. Once cracked, it may never be quite the same, no matter how carefully one repairs it. But one must not despair. Life provides new pieces, sometimes plainer, sometimes more beautiful. The important thing is not to cling too tightly to what is broken, but to learn from it." Beatrice sighed. "You make it sound so simple." "It is not simple," Miss Marple said softly. "But it is true. You are young. The world is wide. This sorrow will not be the end of you, but the shaping of you." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled faintly. "You are very wise, Miss Marple." "No," Miss Marple corrected kindly. "Only very old, and old age, if one pays attention, is full of examples." As summer deepened, the roses bloomed once more in the gardens of St. Mary Mead. Lady Clara's case moved on to the higher courts, where the details would be argued with all the formality of law. But for the villagers, the matter was already closed. They had seen enough, heard enough, and whispered enough. They turned their attention back to their own lives, the harvest, the church fete, and the small dramas of daily existence. One evening, as twilight spread across the village, Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting. The house was quiet, the kettle cooling on the hob. She thought again of Eleanor Whitcomb, of the numbers stitched into her hem, of the desperate courage it had taken to hide her knowledge in such a fragile place. And she thought of Lady Clara, proud and fearful, undone not by hatred, but by her unwillingness to endure disgrace. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was endlessly varied, yet endlessly familiar. Pride, fear, love, and vanity, they were threads woven through every life. Sometimes they formed a pretty pattern, sometimes a tangle, and sometimes a knot that could not be undone. It was her peculiar gift, or perhaps her peculiar burden, to see these threads clearly when others did not. She placed her knitting aside and drew the curtains. Tomorrow would bring another ordinary day and saint. Mary Mead, church bells, gossip at the shops, and perhaps a new letter from her nephew in London. Yet she knew, as she always did, that beneath the surface of ordinary life lay mysteries of the heart, of the mind, and of the soul. They were not always crimes, but they were always instructive. And so, with the quiet satisfaction of one who has untangled another knot in the endless skein of human nature, Miss Marple prepared for bed. The night was still, the roses scented the air, and in the distance the village settled into peace once more. But in her heart, Miss Marple knew peace was always temporary, for where there are people, there will always be secrets. And where there are secrets, there will always be the quiet work of discovering the truth.